Welcome to the History Maps podcast. When a hurricane hits the coast, almost all of our attention goes directly to the storm itself.
Right, the wind speed, the category.
Exactly. We look at the sheer destructive velocity moving across the radar, but we rarely take the time to talk about the seawall that actually absorbs the impact.
Because if the wall holds, there's no disaster to focus on.
Right. And if that wall holds, the story isn't about the wall at all. The story is just about a storm that, failed to break through. So today, we are focusing entirely on the wall.
It is quite a wall to look at.
It really is. We have a stack of medieval Persian chronicles, detailed military logistical analyses, and some really comprehensive long-term climatic data in front of us.
Which paints a very detailed picture.
It does. And the mission of this deep dive is to understand how the Delhi Sultanate essentially built an economic and military seawall to stop the Mongol Empire from, wiping them off the map.
Which is a multi-generational conflict. We're looking at a span from 1221 all the way to 1327.
Right, and ending with a pretty catastrophic raid in 1398.
The scope of this conflict is massive. I mean, we are looking at a period where the Mongols conquered nearly every sedentary civilization they encountered across Eurasia.
Right.
They broke the principalities of Rus, they devastated the Khwarezmian Empire in Persia, and they pushed deep into Eastern Europe.
But the Indian subcontinent didn't fall to them, at least not during the pick of that Mongol war machine.
No, it didn't. And to understand how that happened, we can't just, walk through a simple timeline of battles. We have to dissect the underlying mechanics of it all.
So we're looking at things like the climate, right?
Exactly. The climate, the very specific logistical requirements of a nomadic army, and the highly rigid state-controlled economic reforms that a settled agricultural society used to halt them.
Because they couldn't just stand on a field and hope for the best against the most formidable cavalry force in history.
They definitely could not.
So to understand why the Mongol Empire even looked toward the Indian subcontinent, we have to pull back and look at the push factors.
We have to start deep in the Central Asian steppes.
Right, and we have to start with the weather.
The foundation of this entire conflict is, it's ecological. If you look at the climatic analysis provided in the sources, specifically looking at shifts from the medieval period, there is a very clear demarcation line.
Okay, lay that out for us.
So from roughly the year 800 to 1200, the Central Asian steppe experienced what we call a climatic optimum.
Meaning good weather.
Right. Temperatures were relatively mild, rainfall was steady, and most importantly, the grasslands expanded.
And more grass means more horses.
Yeah, exactly. This abundant pasture allowed nomadic populations and their vital horse herds to multiply rapidly.
But right around 1150, that optimum breaks down.
It breaks down severely. A pattern of deep drought and cold weather begins to take hold in Central Asia, and it worsens significantly between 1200 and 1300.
So what does that actually mean on the ground?
Well, colder temperatures mean less snowmelt in the highlands during the spring. Less snowmelt and less rainfall directly translate to a drastic reduction in grass.
And for a nomadic empire, grass is not just ground cover, right?
No, it is the absolute fuel of their entire civilization and their military.
I want to focus on that word, fuel, because if you are listening to this, it is easy to think of a medieval army as just men with swords carrying their own food.
But a nomadic army operates on a completely different set of biological rules.
Right. The tribes were facing an ecological crisis. To survive, they had to move outward toward fertile river valleys.
But that outward movement exposed the core vulnerability of the Mongol military machine.
Which was what?
Their greatest strength, their mobility, was also an immense logistical burden.
Let's look at the math on that, because the sources go into heavy detail here.
Yeah, we have to look at the math of a Mongol field army. A standard organizational unit, a tumen, consisted nominally of 10,000 cavalry.
About 10,000 men.
But a single Mongol warrior never rode with just one horse. They operated with a string of remounts, usually 3 to 5 horses per man.
3 to 5 horses for every single soldier.
Right. This allowed them to switch mounts on the move, keeping the animals fresh. That is how they achieved their legendary speed and endurance across the steppe.
So, for a single tumen of 10,000 men, you are looking at up to 50,000 horses.
Up to 50,000, yes.
Let's just put the listener in that scene for a second. Imagine being a villager in the 13th century. You don't just see a Mongol army arriving.
You hear it, and you smell it miles before it reaches you.
50,000 horses. The daily requirement to keep that many animals alive in a semi-desert or arid environment is staggering.
The data calculates that this requires roughly 250 tons of hay equivalent every single day.
250 tons. And what about water?
You need 250,000 gallons of water per day.
And crucially, the Mongols did not utilize massive, slow-moving baggage trains carrying grain to feed these animals, did they?
No, their entire doctrine relied on grazing on the hoof.
Okay.
So to extract 250 tons of forage from the natural environment, those 50,000 horses needed to graze over 1,124 acres of pasture per single day.
Over 1,000 acres. Every day.
Every single day.
Which means we really cannot think of a Mongol army as a traditional military unit that just, sets up camp and waits.
Not at all. It operates much more like a massive migrating city that literally devours the landscape down to the dirt as it moves.
They can drain local streams dry in hours.
They can.
So if they are burning through 1,000 acres of grass a day just to exist, how does that army conduct a stationary siege? Or how do they survive a prolonged campaign in a climate that doesn't have endless rolling grasslands?
Mechanistically, they struggle immensely.
Yeah.
You have identified the absolute hard limit of their military doctrine right there.
Yeah.
The Mongols depended on velocity. Continuous movement was the only way to find fresh pasture before the local resources were entirely depleted.
So if they stop, they die.
Pretty much. When they were forced to halt against a fortified city, or when they crossed into the dense, cultivated, and extremely hot landscapes of the Indian plains, their primary advantage became an unsustainable liability.
The horses would quickly starve.
Starve, or they would die of heat exhaustion.
And because they couldn't stay stationary to graze, the Mongols were essentially on a ticking clock the moment they crossed the Indus River.
They absolutely were. Genghis Khan himself found this out the hard way in 1221.
Which brings us to their very first direct encounter with the subcontinent.
Right. In late 1221, Genghis Khan was completing his systematic destruction of the Khwarezmian Empire.
Which encompassed much of modern-day Iran, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan.
Yes. And the last significant pocket of resistance was led by the Khwarezmian prince, Jalal al-Din.
Who was fleeing the destruction of his empire.
Exactly. Fleeing south, he eventually finds himself cornered by Genghis Khan's vanguard at the banks of the Indus River in November.
The chronicles give us a highly vivid vignette of this exact moment.
They do. Jalal al-Din realizes his forces are completely outmatched. He's trapped against the turbulent waters of the Indus.
And instead of surrendering or dying on the field,
he forces his horse to leap directly off the bank into the torrential water.
He swims across the river under arrow fire, escaping into the Punjab region on the eastern side.
And Genghis Khan reportedly watched this happen.
But he didn't order his main army to cross after him?
No, he didn't. Instead, he detached a smaller force, 2 tumans, roughly 20,000 troops, under the command of generals like Dorbay the Fierce, to continue the pursuit.
Those 2 tumans crossed the Indus and entered the Punjab.
They sacked the area surrounding Lahore and pushed southward toward the major city of Multan.
According to the Persian historian Juvaini, Multan was actually on the verge of surrendering to the Mongols.
Yes, the defenders were totally overwhelmed by the suddenness and brutality of the assault. But before the city could fall, the physical environment intervened.
Juvaini's text is very specific here. He writes that the great heat of the climate prevented the Mongols from remaining any longer.
They had plundered the province, but the extreme temperatures of the Indian plains began to decimate their step-bred horses.
And the men themselves.
Right. They simply could not sustain the siege. The heat forced them to break off, recross the Indus, and march back to rejoin Genghis Khan's main forces who were retreating toward Afghanistan.
Meanwhile, Jalal ad-Din, who had survived his leap into the Indus, was desperately trying to build an anti-Mongol alliance in the Punjab.
He sent envoys to the ruler of the Delhi Sultanate, Sultan Iltutmish.
Formally requesting asylum.
Yes.
Iltutmish looks at the situation and flatly refuses him. He denies the asylum.
It was an act of profound diplomatic pragmatism.
Why?
Iltutmish recognized that offering sanctuary to Jalal al-Din would give Genghis Khan the perfect legal pretext to launch a full-scale permanent invasion of the Delhi Sultanate.
So he prioritized the survival of his own young, fragile state over the traditional obligations of offering refuge to a fellow Muslim ruler.
Exactly. By turning Jalal al-Din away, he effectively removed the immediate target off of Delhi's back.
It's a fascinating sequence of events. Genghis Khan, the architect of an empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea, was essentially repelled from the Indian subcontinent by the weather.
He was.
But for the people in Delhi, this wasn't a victory to celebrate. They escaped the initial wave, but the psychological impact of seeing what 20,000 Mongol cavalry could do to Lahore must have been immense.
Oh, the psychological impact fundamentally altered the architecture of the Delhi Sultanate.
How so?
Well, they had just received a terrifying preview of horse archer tactics. The speed of the maneuver, the lethality of the composite bows, the absolute leveling of agricultural zones.
It created a state of enduring structural paranoia within the Sultanate.
Yes, the geographic isolation that had historically protected the Indian subcontinent from Central Asian powers was no longer sufficient.
So over the next several decades, Delhi recognized that heavily militarizing its northwestern frontier was its only guarantee of survival.
And they had every reason to be paranoid.
Because Genghis Khan eventually died, and his massive empire fractured into several distinct massive khanates.
And the one that took control of Central Asia, settling right on India's doorstep, was the Chagatai Khanate.
And the Chagatai Khanate was an incredibly aggressive neighbor.
Very aggressive. And this aggression was driven heavily by those exact climatic and ecological pressures we discussed at the start, combined with, well, internal political instability.
So between the 1230s and the 1290s, the Chagatai Mongols launched near constant opportunistic raids across the border into the subcontinent.
But if you track the data, these were not random attacks.
No, they systematically timed their incursions with the Indian harvest season.
They would wait until the crops were mature, cross the frontier, and target the Sultanate's agricultural base.
Right. In 1241, forces under Dayr Noyan captured the city of Lahore. In 1245, they pushed into Multan again.
During this extended period, particularly during the reign of Sultan Balban, who ruled from 1266 to 1287, the Delhi Sultanate was essentially forced to play a game of passive defense.
What did that look like?
Balban recognized that marching his army deep into the steppe to fight the Mongols on their own terms would be suicidal.
Because of the mobility issue.
Right. Instead, he ceased all distant expansionist campaigns within India. He kept his primary army close to the capital of Delhi.
And he focused vast resources on building and reinforcing a network of heavy stone forts along the frontier to act as a physical buffer.
Now, if you're listening to this and wondering why no one just bought off the Mongols,
Right, like a massive medieval protection racket paying them tribute to stay away.
you have to look at the internal mechanics of the Chagatai Khanate.
Okay, explain that.
Paying tribute implies the other side has a central authority that can enforce a peace treaty. But the Chagatai Khans were constantly dealing with internal rebellions, dynastic rivalries, and severe pastoral scarcity.
So that internal dysfunction is key here.
To maintain the loyalty of their elite military commanders, the Khans had to provide constant streams of plunder.
So the wealth of the agricultural plains of India was a vital economic resource for them.
Yes. Raiding India was not just a strategic choice, it was an economic necessity to sustain their own highly volatile political structure in Central Asia.
If a Khan stopped raiding, he couldn't pay his lords and he would be overthrown.
Exactly.
So for decades, this border war just grinds on. The Sultanate is playing a strict zone defense against a neighbor conducting seasonal smash-and-grab operations.
There is a notable detail from the year 1292, actually.
Oh, right. A Mongol vanguard under a commander named Abdullah invades, but they miscalculate and are defeated by the Sultanate's forces.
And 4,000 of these Mongol captives are given the option to convert to Islam, which they do.
And they are actually settled in a suburb of Delhi.
They name the suburb Mughapura.
Which tells us that the frontier was complex. The Sultanate was willing to absorb and integrate skilled Mongol cavalrymen into its own society when the opportunity arose.
But a defensive posture of building forts and taking in defectors was never going to solve the root problem.
Because the Chagatai Khanate was growing more organized, and the raids were escalating in scale.
Right.
Okay, but here's what I don't get. If paying tribute doesn't work and building passive defensive forts fails to stop the raids from burning the harvests, what is left?
Not much under the old system.
Right. I mean, how does a medieval society fight a hypermobile nomadic army without bankrupting itself?
The answer, it turns out, requires a ruler willing to completely restructure society from the ground up.
And that ruler took the throne in 1296.
Aladdin Khilji.
He took power in 1296 through a violent usurpation, right, assassinating his own uncle.
Yes, assassinating the ruling sultan, Jalaluddin. Aladdin was a ruthless individual, but he was a supreme pragmatist regarding the security of the state.
He looked at the frontier and realized that the passive defense strategy established by Bulban was failing.
The Mongols were pushing deeper. Aladdin determined that the only way to stop a professional war machine was to build one of his own.
And he didn't just tweak the military, he overhauled the entire state economy.
To fight the Mongols on equal footing, he established a massive standing army.
The historical chronicles estimate the size of this force at 475,000 cavalrymen.
But the critical innovation wasn't just the sheer number of soldiers, it was how they were compensated.
Aladdin paid this massive force directly in fixed cash salaries.
The shift to cash payment is perhaps the most revolutionary administrative change in this era.
Prior to Aladdin, troops in the Sultanate were primarily maintained through the ikuta system, correct?
Yes.
Let's explain how the ikuta system actually functions, because it's vital to understanding why Aladdin scrapped it.
The ikuta was essentially a feudal land grant. The central government would assign a specific region of land to a nobleman. That nobleman collected the agricultural taxes from that land, kept a portion for his own wealth, and in return, he was obligated to maintain a specific number of armed troops to provide to the Sultan when requested.
But the problem with fighting Mongols using a feudal army is time and loyalty.
Time is the biggest issue.
Right. If a Chagatai raid crosses the border in October, the Sultan sends messengers to his nobles. The nobles have to gather their men from the farms, equip them, and march to the staging ground.
By the time the Ikita army is fully mobilized, the Mongols have already burned the crops, taken the loot, and are halfway back to Kabul.
Furthermore, a feudal soldier's daily loyalty lies with the noble who feeds him, not the Sultan in Delhi.
Precisely. The Ikasa system creates a decentralized, slow-to-react military structure. Aladdin required instant mobilization.
So by abolishing the reliance on Ika grants for his core army and moving to direct cash salaries paid from the royal treasury, he created a highly centralized, professional military force.
These men were soldiers full-time. They answered exclusively to the Sultan, and they could be deployed to the frontier the moment an intelligence report came in.
But managing a cash-paid army of nearly 500,000 men introduces massive administrative challenges.
Human nature being what it is, people will try to defraud the government.
Oh, absolutely. If a soldier is given a generous cash stipend to maintain a high-quality war horse, there is a strong temptation to sell that good horse, buy a cheap, broken-down pack mule, present the mule at the annual inspection to collect the check, and pocket the difference.
To eliminate that specific type of corruption, Aladdin instituted a strict system called the Da.
The branding.
Yes. Every single horse that passed military inspection and was registered for state pay was physically branded with a hot iron bearing the royal mark.
It functioned very much like requiring registered VIN numbers on modern military vehicles.
Exactly. If an inspector reviewed a cavalry unit, every horse had to bear the Da. You could not swap a useless animal into the ranks to defraud the treasury.
And he applied a similar logic to the soldiers themselves with a system called the Chera, or Hulia.
Right, Chera was the creation of highly detailed, written descriptive roles for every single individual soldier in the army.
Since there was no photography, the military clerks would document a soldier's height, build, eye color, facial hair, and any distinguishing scars or marks.
It was a medieval biometric ID system.
It ensured that the trained, experienced soldier who actually earned the salary was the one showing up to fight.
Rather than that soldier subcontracting his deployment out to an untrained proxy laborer for a fraction of the cost on the day of the battle.
So the DE and the Chera ensure the army is professional and properly equipped.
Yes.
But there is a glaring mathematical problem here. Maintaining 475,000 cavalrymen in hard cash requires a staggering, almost impossible amount of money.
It does.
How did the state afford this?
This is where Aladdin implements one of the most radical, draconian economic policies seen in the medieval world. To make the state treasury last, he had to ensure that the cash salary paid to the soldier was sufficient to cover the soldier's living expenses, his family, his weapons, and his horse.
Right, because if inflation rose, the soldiers would demand higher pay, which the state could not afford.
So, rather than increasing the money supply, Aladdin artificially deflated the entire economy. He instituted strict, state-mandated market price controls on nearly every essential commodity.
We have the specific numbers from the sources. He fixed the price of wheat at 7.5 UDOLs per mont.
To put that in perspective, a mond is a heavy bulk measure, roughly around 30 to 40 pounds depending on the specific era.
And a jittel was a copper coin.
Right. By locking wheat at 7.5 jittels, he slashed the cost of living so drastically that a soldier on a basic state salary could comfortably afford his equipment and feed his family.
He established massive state granaries to hold reserves. He banned private merchants from hoarding grain, and he set fixed, non-negotiable prices for barley, rice, cloth, sugar, and even horses in the market.
He fundamentally decoupled the military supply chain from the natural fluctuations of supply and demand.
By doing so, he transferred the agricultural wealth of the entire society directly into the maintenance of the military apparatus.
He did.
Now, history is littered with leaders who try to mandate artificial price controls.
Yes.
And almost universally, it leads to disaster. When the state forces a merchant to sell goods for less than they are worth, the merchant stops bringing goods to the market.
It leads to massive black markets, food shortages, and total economic collapse.
So how did Aladdin enforce this unnatural economy without his empire imploding?
He enforced it through an unparalleled system of surveillance and sheer, unadulterated terror.
Let's get into that.
Aladdin created a massive, highly centralized intelligence agency known as the Barid-e-Mumalek. He deployed spies, known as Barids and Mahians, into every level of society.
Let's talk about daily life under the Barid. It wasn't just military espionage, it was domestic market enforcement.
Absolutely. The spies were embedded in every market square, every town, and even within the households of the nobility.
They monitored conversations, they tracked the movement of goods, and they rigorously checked prices.
Furthermore, the punishments for violating the price controls were horrific.
The chronicles detail that if a merchant was caught short-weighting, a customer, say, selling a bag of grain that was a few ounces lighter than the state mandate, the inspectors would carve an equivalent amount of flesh directly from the merchant's body.
It is a terrifying level of state control. But from Aladdin's perspective, the existential threat of the Mongols provided the ultimate justification.
It was a command economy built entirely for national security.
The terror kept the merchants in line, the price controls kept the soldiers fed, and the standing army stood ready.
And that rapid response force was immediately put to the absolute limit.
Yes.
Because as Delhi was centralizing its military, the nature of the Mongol invasions was fundamentally changing.
They were no longer just looking to burn crops and steal cattle. They were coming for conquest.
The shift occurs in 1299. The Chagatai Khanate dispatched a massive, highly organized army under the command of a prominent prince named Kuatlu Quacha.
Unlike previous raids that targeted the borderlands, Kuatlu Quacha bypassed the frontier forts entirely.
His explicit stated goal was to march directly on the capital, lay siege to Delhi, and conquer the Sultanate once and for all.
This sets up the Battle of Kili in 1299.
Kuatlu Quacha arrives near Delhi. Aladdin does not hide behind the city walls. He marches his newly reformed army out to meet them at a place called Kili, just a few miles from the capital.
He deploys a force estimated at roughly 70,000 heavy cavalry and, significantly, 700 war elephants.
But Aladdin's strategy on the field is completely counterintuitive for a medieval ruler.
Very much so.
He doesn't order a massive, glorious charge. His strategy is pure attrition.
Aladdin understood the logistical constraints of the nomadic army better than any ruler before him.
He knew that Kuatlu Quacha's massive army was surrounded by hostile territory, far from their steppe supply lines.
Aladdin heavily fortified his camp, secured the local water sources for his own men, and set up a dense, heavily defended screen of infantry and elephants.
He realized he didn't need to destroy the Mongols in open hand-to-hand combat.
Right, he just needed to hold the line, protect his water, and let the sheer heat and lack of pasture slowly starve the Mongol horses.
It's a brilliant, disciplined plan.
But military plans rarely survive contact with the enemy, or in this case, contact with ambitious, glory-seeking general.
Exactly. Aladdin's commander of the right wing was a man named Zafar Khan.
Zafar Khan was highly respected, a veteran of the frontier wars, but he disobeys Aladdin's strict orders to hold the defensive line.
Without authorization, Zafar Khan orders his heavy cavalry to launch a massive, full-scale charge against the Mongol left wing.
And by doing so, he falls into the most famous and deadly tactical trap in the Mongol playbook, the feigned retreat, often called the Mangudai tactic.
Let's explain the mechanics of the feigned retreat, because it requires incredible psychological discipline from the Mongols to pull it off.
When Zafar Khan charges, the Mongol left wing engages briefly and then suddenly breaks formation.
They appear to panic.
Right. They turn their horses and flee the battlefield in apparent chaos.
To a commander like Zafar Khan, it looks like a rout. It looks like
Exactly.
victory is imminent if he just chases them down.
So he pushes his heavy cavalry harder, pursuing the fleeing Mongols for miles, drawing his forces completely away from the main body of Alauddin's army.
But the Mongols are not panicking. They are controlling the distance perfectly.
Once Zafar Khan is miles away from support, and more importantly, once his heavy horses are completely exhausted from the long sprint in the heat, the trap snaps shut.
The fleeing Mongols suddenly wheel their horses around in unison.
Additional Mongol units that were hiding in reserve close the flanks. They envelop Zafar Khan's exhausted forces and unleash a devastating barrage of arrows.
Zafar Khan fights ferociously to the death, refusing to surrender, but his entire division is cut to pieces.
Zafar Khan's rogue charge represents a massive clash of military cultures.
The primary chronicles often highlight the tension between the old ideal of feudal, individual heroics and Alauddin's new system of professional, centralized discipline.
Among the common soldiers, Zafar Khan achieved a sort of legendary martyr status for his bravery against overwhelming odds.
But Alauddin was reportedly furious.
He was. Alauddin deeply resented the disobedience. His entire military and economic reform was built on absolute centralized control and strict resource denial.
So Zafar Khan's charge was a massive, unnecessary risk that squandered a key general and thousands of elite cavalrymen.
Despite the catastrophic loss of Zafar Khan's division, Alauddin's overarching strategy of attrition ultimately held.
The main Sultanate lines did not break.
Deprived of forage, battered by the engagement, and unable to crack Alauddin's fortified camp, Kuatlu Khwaja's massive army was forced into an agonizing retreat in the middle of the night.
Kuatlu Khwaja himself was severely wounded during the fighting and died on the grueling march back to Central Asia.
It was a monumental victory for Delhi, but the Chagatai Khana was relentless.
They absorbed the loss and reorganized. 4 years later, in 1303, they launched another major invasion.
This time, the army was led by a general named Taragai.
And Taragai executed his campaign with brilliant timing.
He marched on Delhi right when Alauddin was far away, bogged down in a difficult siege campaign in Rajputana near Chittor.
Alauddin's intelligence network alerts him, and he rushes back to Delhi just in time.
But his army is battered from the Rajput campaign, and he doesn't have the time or the numbers to assemble his forces for an open battle like Kili.
He is forced to take shelter in Siri Fort, a massive defensive structure near Delhi that is actually still under construction at the time.
He entrenches his remaining troops and waits.
Taragai's forces arrive and completely surround the fort.
For 2 agonizing months, the Mongols pillage the suburbs of Delhi, looting the surrounding towns, while Alauddin is trapped inside.
But once again, the physical realities of the subcontinent dictate the outcome.
Taragai lacks the heavy siege equipment to breach the stone walls of Siri Fort.
And outside the walls, the logistical impossibility of feeding tens of thousands of horses during the extreme heat of the Indian summer begins to destroy his army.
Facing starvation and disease, Taragai is forced to abandon the siege and retreat.
These 2 massive standoffs at the gates of Delhi Kili and Siri Fort revealed a very distinct tactical divide between the 2 forces.
We are essentially watching 2 completely different military doctrines clashing on the plains of northern India.
Let's break down exactly how a sedentary agricultural army managed to match the legendary Mongol cavalry in open combat.
Based on the detailed analysis by military historians like Professor John Masson Smith Jr. and the primary records of the traveler Ibn Battuta, the cavalry of the Delhi Sultanate was fundamentally different from the Mongol cavalry in almost every way.
The contrast is stark.
Very. The Mongol warrior rode steppe-grazed ponies. These animals were relatively small, weighing around 600 pounds.
They were incredibly hardy, possessing immense stamina to cover vast distances, but they lacked the mass for heavy physical impact.
Consequently, the Mongol warrior relied on hit-and-run tactics. They wore very light armor, usually leather or silk, and sought to completely avoid hand-to-hand combat.
Their doctrine was to shower the enemy with armor-piercing arrows from a distance until the enemy formation fractured, and only then sweep in.
The Delhi Sultanate, by contrast, built its military around heavy cavalry.
And crucially, they did not rely on local Indian horses, which were often unsuited for heavy armor.
The Sultanate utilized its vast treasury to import large, powerful war horses from the Golden Horde territories in Russia and from the Middle East.
These imported horses were fed a diet of rich grain and specialized forage rather than just wild grass.
This diet allowed them to grow much larger, heavier, and stronger than the Mongol ponies.
And because the horses could carry more weight, the Sultanate heavily armored both the rider and the horse itself with steel and mail.
Furthermore, the core of the Delhi army was composed of highly trained slave soldiers, known as Mamluks,
The Mamluk system was utilized across the Islamic world.
most famously in Egypt, where Mamluk armies also successfully defeated the Mongols.
These men were purchased as youths, often from Central Asia, and placed into a rigorous, systematic, lifelong training regimen funded entirely by the state.
The sources provide incredibly specific details regarding this training.
These Mamluks were not just soldiers. They were elite martial athletes.
They were expected to be able to draw their composite bows and shoot 3 arrows in 1.5 seconds.
Let's think about the mechanics of that. To achieve that speed, they utilized specialized techniques like the thumb draw, holding spare arrows in their draw hand rather than reaching back to a quiver.
And they were trained to strike with the sword 3 times a second while galloping on horseback. They were the ultimate shock troops.
And supporting this wall of heavy cavalry was a biological asset that the Mongols had never successfully countered in open combat.
Heavily armored war elephants. Aladdin deployed hundreds of these massive beasts as a physical screen at the front of his army.
I picture this clash like a battle of completely different military eras.
How so?
Well, the Mongols operate like a massive fleet of fast, lightly armored attack boats, swarming, firing, and retreating.
Right.
The Delhi army operates like a heavily armored, highly disciplined tank division, supported by mobile artillery in the form of the war elephants.
That analogy captures the physical reality perfectly. The Mongols simply could not bring their usual advantages of speed and maneuverability to bear.
When they were confined by the agricultural terrain of India, forced into closer quarters by the geography, they faced larger, grain-fed horses that could withstand a charge.
Highly disciplined rapid-fire archery from the Mamluks that matched their own, and the sheer, overwhelming terror of the elephants.
The traditional steppe tactics completely faltered in these prolonged, close-range engagements.
The elephants physically disrupted the Mongol lines, smashing through cavalry formations.
But more importantly, the Mongol ponies, entirely unaccustomed to the sight, the sheer size, and the distinct smell of elephants, would absolutely panic and refuse to charge, throwing the Mongol ranks into chaos.
And once the logistical weaknesses of the Mongols were exposed by the climate and their tactical advantages were neutralized by the heavy cavalry and the elephants, the subsequent invasions didn't just end in a negotiated retreat.
They ended in absolute annihilation.
Which brings us to the pivotal, crushing battles of 1305 and 1306.
Having failed to take Delhi directly twice, the Chagatai Khanate shifted their strategy.
On December 20, 1305, 2 prominent Mongol commanders, Ali Beg and Tartak, lead a massive invasion force across the border.
But this time, they deliberately avoid the heavily fortified capital. They march their forces southeast, aiming to bypass Delhi entirely and raid the wealthy, densely populated agricultural zones of the Gangetic Plains.
If you can't crack the vault of the capital, you try to burn down the factory making the money.
It makes strategic sense. But Aladdin's massive investment in his spy network, the Barid, proves its worth here.
The intelligence network detects the Mongol movement early and tracks their trajectory. Aladdin does not wait.
He dispatches his general, Malik Nayak, with an intercept force of 30,000 elite heavy cavalry.
Malik Nayak intercepts the Mongol army near the town of Amroha, and the specific geography of the terrain plays a massive role in the outcome.
The Mongols are operating in a confined agricultural landscape. The ground is broken up by deep irrigation ditches, dense crop fields, and local villages.
This terrain completely prevents the Mongols from dispersing into their wide-ranging fluid formations.
Malik Nayak uses his heavy cavalry to force them into a bottleneck, compelling them into close-quarters combat, where the heavy armor and larger horses of the Sultanate hold the absolute advantage.
The Mongol army is systematically crushed.
The Sultanate forces capture the 2 commanders, Ali Beg and Tartak, alive, along with roughly 8,000 Mongol troops.
And what happens next in the aftermath is a brutal, calculated display of state power.
Aladdin orders the captured commanders and the thousands of prisoners to be transported back to Delhi.
They are paraded through the streets in heavy chains.
And then, in a massive public spectacle, they are executed by being thrown beneath the feet of charging war
It
elephants.
was a deliberate psychological terror tactic.
It was a conscious mirroring of the Mongols' own use of terror.
For decades, the Mongols had used mass executions and psychological warfare to break the will of their enemies.
Aladdin was sending a very clear, visceral message back to the Chagatai Khanate. The rules of engagement on the subcontinent have fundamentally changed.
There will be no negotiations, no ransom of prisoners, only total destruction.
The very next year, in 1306, the Mongols attempt one last massive push.
A three-pronged invasion led by commanders Kopek, Iqbalmand, and Taibu crosses the Indus into the Punjab.
And they meet an absolute wall. They are utterly destroyed at the banks of the Ravi River by the Sultanate's premier frontier commanders, Malik Kafur and Ghazi Melik Tughluq.
The historical sources describe the battle not as a military engagement, but as a massacre.
This battle at the Ravi River is the culmination of every reform Aladdin instituted.
The cash-paid standing army, the rapid mobilization protocols, the intelligence network, it all functions flawlessly to intercept, surround, and obliterate the invaders before they can even threaten the core territories.
There is a highly specific detail from the Battle of Amroha, the year prior, that stands out in the logistics.
Oh, right.
The sources note that after the battle, the Sultanate captured 20,000 superior Mongol horses from the dead and retreating enemy.
Yes.
How did this specific capture of livestock permanently shift the balance of power between the two states?
It represents a critical turning point logistical victory.
Because they needed those horses.
Desperately. The Delhi Sultanate, despite its vast wealth, always struggled with a chronic geographical shortage of high-quality equine stock.
The hot, humid climate of much of India is not conducive to breeding the large war horses needed for cavalry. They constantly had to spend vast amounts of their treasury importing horses from abroad.
Capturing 20,000 step-hardened horses directly from the enemy solved that deficit instantly.
It allowed Delhi to integrate Mongol mobility into their own heavy cavalry formations.
By capturing the enemy's primary biological asset, they completely neutralized the Chagatai Khanate's main advantage. They secured the frontier by, quite literally, absorbing the strength of their attackers.
And the staggering victories of 1305 and 1306 didn't just stop the invasions, they fundamentally flipped the script.
The hunted became the hunter.
In 1307, the powerful Chagatai Khan, Dua, dies.
His death acts as a catalyst, plunging the Khanate into a bitter, protracted succession dispute and civil war. The Mongol princes turned their weapons inward against each other.
Taking immediate advantage of this chaos, Ghazi Malik Tughluq, who was the hardened governor of Dipalpur on the frontier, goes on the offensive.
He decides he is no longer going to wait for the harvest season raids. He doesn't just defend the border, he crosses it.
He launches annual, highly aggressive, punitive raids directly into the heart of Mongol territories.
He leads his heavy cavalry into the mountainous regions of Kabul, Ghazni, and Kandahar. He plunders their pastoral lands, burns their settlements, and levies heavy tribute on their populations.
It is an incredible psychological and military reversal of fortune.
Inscriptions and chronicles from the time claim that Ghazi Melik Tughluq defeated the Mongols between 20 and 29 distinct times during this period.
He is utilizing the exact rapid deployment, hit-and-run tactics the Sultanate had suffered under for decades, turning it back against the Mongols.
The Delhi Sultanate had successfully institutionalized its anti-Mongol defenses.
The command economy established by Aladdin, the vast intelligence network, and the devastating tactical integration of heavy cavalry and war elephants had created a permanent proactive shield over northern India.
And this system outlasts Aladdin himself. The Tughlaq dynasty eventually succeeds the Khiljis.
And the wall holds. In 1327, the Tughlaqs face one final major Chagatai incursion led by a Khan named Tarmashirin.
The Sultanate forces repel him, pushing the Mongols all the way back across the Indus River for the last time. For nearly a century, the wall holds firm.
But as we know from history, defensive structures only hold as long as the political institutions manning them remain stable and vigilant.
By the late 14th century, the Delhi Sultanate began to decay from within.
The strict, centralized control of the economy loosened, the army fractured into regional factions, and devastating civil wars drained the treasury.
And in 1398, when the state is fractured, the army is weak, and the seawall is crumbling, a new conqueror appears on the horizon.
One who claims the direct legacy of Genghis Khan.
Timur, also known in the West as Tamerlane.
Right.
He was a brilliant, utterly ruthless Turco-Mongol conqueror operating out of Central Asia. He looked southward and recognized that the iron grip of the Delhi Sultanate had slipped.
The unified standing army of 500,000 men was a shadow of what it had been under Alauddin Khilji, and the administration was paralyzed by infighting.
Timur invades India in 1398.
His publicly stated motivation is a religious jihad against the rulers of the Delhi Sultanate, claiming they had grown too tolerant of their Hindu subjects.
But the sources are abundantly clear that his practical driving motivation was the vast, legendary wealth accumulated in the Indian cities over centuries.
Unlike the massive Chagatai invasions that faced Alauddin's united, impenetrable front, Timur faces a broken, localized system.
He advances rapidly through the Punjab. When local fortresses try to block his path, he doesn't waste time on long sieges.
His engineers quickly construct pontoon bridges over rivers like the Ravi to simply bypass the defensive structures entirely, keeping his momentum pushing toward Delhi.
Before he even reaches the capital, Timur demonstrates a level of calculated, cold-blooded brutality that shocks even the hardened military standards of the medieval era.
As his army marches, they capture tens of thousands of prisoners. Approaching Delhi, Timur realizes that guarding this massive number of prisoners while trying to fight a major battle is a logistical nightmare.
And he worries they might rise up against him. So he solves the logistical problem with a massacre.
He orders the execution of 50,000 captives in a single day.
On December 17, 1398, the climactic Battle of Delhi takes place.
Timur faces the remnants of the Sultanate army. The Indian forces still field their most terrifying weapon, the heavy war elephants.
But Timur is a master tactician, and he has studied the previous Mongol defeats. He is entirely prepared for the elephants.
He neutralizes them completely. First, he orders his elite archers to focus their fire entirely on the mahouts, the men driving and directing the elephants, rather than wasting arrows on the thick armor of the beasts themselves.
Without the drivers, the animals lose direction.
But his second tactic is far more devastating. He uses caltrops.
Iron spikes with 4 points, designed so that one sharp point is always facing upward when scattered on the ground.
Let's talk about how caltrops actually stop a 5-ton animal. An elephant's foot is highly sensitive.
Very sensitive, yes.
When they charge forward and step on a field of these iron spikes, the spikes pierce deep into the foot.
The sudden agonizing pain causes immediate panic in the animal.
A panicked, pain-maddened war elephant doesn't just stop in its tracks. It turns around to flee the source of the pain, violently crashing back through its own lines, crushing the Indian infantry that was advancing behind it.
Timur didn't just kill the elephants, he weaponized their mass and panic against the Sultanate itself. He throws the Indian lines into total chaos.
Timur is victorious on the field. He enters the gates of Delhi, and what follows is undeniably one of the darkest chapters in the city's long history.
For 5 continuous days, Timur's forces ruthlessly sack the city.
They massacre an estimated 100,000 civilians. The chronicles describe Timur's forces building literal pyramids out of the severed skulls of the dead to terrorize any remaining resistance.
He completely strips the city of the wealth that had been accumulated by the Delhi Sultans over the past 2 centuries.
Finally, in early 1399, he packs up and withdraws back to Central Asia, taking with him immense plunder, 120 surviving war elephants, and thousands of enslaved Indian artisans to build his monuments.
But looking at this total devastation, I have to ask,
Right. If Timur was so overwhelmingly successful, if he broke the Sultanate's army and took the capital, why didn't he stay?
why didn't he occupy India and fold it permanently into his empire, like the Chagatai Khans had tried so desperately to do for 100 years?
Because Timur's campaign was purely intentionally predatory. He was a strategic genius, and he understood the brutal logistical constraints of the Indian climate perfectly.
He knew that maintaining a permanent occupying army in the extreme heat, thousands of miles from his pastoral supply lines in the steppe, was a recipe for eventual defeat.
He didn't want to govern India. He came specifically for the wealth required to fund his own massive imperial ambitions back in his capital of Samarkand.
He extracted the resources he needed, decimated a potential rival, and deliberately left behind a ruined power vacuum, entirely avoiding a costly, permanent occupation.
So we have traced this incredible bloody arc.
The Mongol invasions were a crucible.
The existential, terrifying threat of the Chagatai Khanate forced the Delhi Sultanate to radically evolve from a loose collection of feudal landholdings into a highly centralized, professionalized, and militarized state.
It was a perfect storm of factors that ultimately saved the broader Indian subcontinent from total conquest.
The brutal realities of the Indian climate negated the Mongols' mobility and logistical advantages.
The state-mandated market economics of Alauddin Khilji, enforced by terror, successfully funded a massive standing army.
And the tactical combination of disciplined heavy cavalry and armored war elephants created an impenetrable wall against the greatest empire of the era,
Which brings us right back to where we started.
the hurricane and the seawall.
The Delhi Sultans, particularly Alauddin Khilji, are often remembered by history for their ruthless authoritarianism.
The pervasive espionage, the brutal executions, the absolute crushing control over the daily economy.
But if you look at the destruction Timur unleashed in just a few days,
And realize that those exact tyrannical measures of Aladdin were the only things standing between the Indian subcontinent and complete annihilation by the Mongols for a century.
it leaves us with a heavy question.
How do we weigh the moral cost of survival against the price of freedom?
It is a profound question, and one that challenges how we judge the drastic actions of states when they are pushed to the absolute brink of total destruction.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.